Hello, welcome to Visions and Revisions in Popular Music at the Brooklyn Book Festival, where we are exploring how the meaning and legacy of popular music has both shaped and reflected the societal forces, conversations, and revolutions of our times, and how it is being rewritten and rewritten, written and rewritten. We have three incredible writers with us today, Sasha Geffen, Maureen Mann, and Marcus J. Moore. I'm Just Skolnik, and I am the senior editor of Bandcamp Daily and an activist and arts journalist. And I am very excited that all of you are here with us, and very excited to talk to these three incredible writers who I will introduce you to now. Sasha Geffen is the author of Glitter Up the Dark, How Pop Music Broke the Binary. They're a writer based in Colorado. Their work focuses on the intersections between pop culture and gender and has appeared in Rolling Stone, Pitchfork, Artforum, The Nation, and The New Inquiry, among others. Maureen Mann is the author of Black Diamond Queens, African American Women, and Rock and Roll. She's a cultural anthropologist, and she teaches in the Department of Music at New York University. She's also written Right to Rock, the Black Rock Coalition, and the Cultural Politics of Race. Her articles on African American music have appeared in academic journals and on the websites of National Public Radio and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Marcus J. Moore is an award-winning music journalist, editor, curator, and pop culture commentator, whose writing can be found in the New York Times, The Washington Post, Entertainment Weekly, The Nation, NPR, The Atlantic, Bandcamp Daily, Pitchfork, BBC Music, and MTV, among others. He's created nationally syndicated playlists for Google, discussed new music live on FM radio, interviewed musicians for Sonos, and guest hosted live shows on Red Bull Radio. He was originally from the Washington, D.C. area and now lives in Brooklyn, New York. The Butterfly Effect is his first book. So welcome, you guys. Thank you so much for joining us. All of your books really join both personal perspective and historical rigor and really incredible cultural criticism in really unique and vibrant ways. And so I wanted to ask each of you how you came to write your project. Tell us a little bit more about your book, how you came to this project, and sort of what you hoped the goal would be in writing it. And whoever, Sasha, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I guess I started writing Glitter in 2018, and it was a couple years into covering what felt like mostly trans musicians across a variety of platforms. So writing album reviews, interviewing people, and something about talking about music with other trans people felt just comfortable and also really invigorating. And also just like writing through like why music made by trans people specifically kind of animated me so much. And I think it was like around the time that Sophie was putting out her first album. Arca had just put out her self-titled, where she's like really featuring her voice for the first time. Just like a lot of contemporary artists were occupying a certain position of identity that spoke to my own, and also kind of seemed to breach new ground in interesting ways. So I wanted to take a historical look at this phenomenon, at the ways that music has been kind of a staging ground for the articulation of gender identities, whether that's reiterating kind of established gender identities. You know, there are plenty of songs that are just about cis dudes being dudes, and that's also like music doing gender, even though it's kind of accepted as like the norm or accepted as standard and not really pushing any boundaries. It's still a performance of gender within music. So I kind of dug in and started doing history, and it turns out that, you know, every layer you peel back on pop music, rock music as it is now, you get people who have transgressed gender in one way or another. Um, you know, blues women in the Harlem Renaissance dressing up in top hats and coattails and doing drag, um, or people like Jackie Shane who were drag performers before they could really articulate their identities as trans women, to, you know, electronic pioneers like Wendy Carlos and Sylvester and disco. It's like every stage of popular music's evolution, you get people who have defied gender at the same time that they're defying genre. So my book was an attempt to kind of go to the root of pop music as it is, more or less. There's like, you know, you can argue about when it takes root, when that specific word makes the most sense to apply, um, and kind of sweep it up into the present moment to get a better sense of why things sound the way they do now, and why trans identities seem to find such fertile expression in music specifically. So that was kind of the journey for me, as it were.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Maureen, I would like to hear about your journey.
So thank you, Jess, for moderating the panel and for your question. So I think the easiest way for me to respond is to say that I've had a very long-standing interest in the relationship between African Americans and rock music, or African Americans and rock and roll. And it started as it was my relationship to popular music. It was music that I was interested in, and it was the music that I was a fan of. And I got messages right away that it was unusual for a Black person to be engaged with rock and roll. So that really guided me to write my first book, which was about the Black Rock Coalition and African Americans who were trying to reclaim the right to rock in the 1980s and 90s. And in the course of talking with them and thinking about the music that I was interested in and wanting to do a more focused project on African American women and rock and thinking about contemporary women, I realized that I really didn't know that much about the women who had come before. And so I started thinking that that would be an interesting topic to explore. And I think this is sort of an old trope, but I was really writing a book that I wish that I could have read when I was a teenager back in the 80s, listening to this music and getting strange responses from people for doing so. But I especially wanted to focus on women because I was curious about women and their role. And it seemed like whenever I read histories of rock and roll, the more mainstream or traditional histories, the women, the Black women were sort of there, but they were never really the focus. And so I wanted to put African American women at the center of the story and really shift the way we think about the history of rock and roll. So that's what I tried to do in the book. And it's interesting, you know, to think on, it's been a very long journey. That you chose the word journey to talk about. It's been a very long journey to come to this book at this point.
Yeah, totally. I'm really glad that you wrote the book that you wanted to read. That's super important and cool. Marcus, your book is about Kendrick Lamar, and it's a cultural autobiography of Kendrick's life. What brought you to writing about Kendrick?
Yeah, I've been a huge fan of Kendrick's probably since 2011, when Section 80 came out. And I was introduced to Kendrick like everybody was. Like, you hop on Pitchfork and you see that Section 80 got like an 8.0, and you're like, who's this kid? Like, they don't give scores that high for, for people we don't know. And so that kind of led me down this path of like, who is this guy and what does his music represent? And so obviously I had been following Kendrick back then, and I love Good Kid, Mad City. But then as a jazz head, To Pimp a Butterfly cracked my head open. Like it, because when you open the liner notes, it had all of the people who I'd been jumping up and down about for years, like all through it. So, the first beat is by Flying Lotus and Thundercats all over it. You have Kamasi Washington on it, Robert Glasper, Terrace Martin, all of these people. And so, that's still my favorite Kendrick Lamar album. And one day, it was a random day. I was still at Bandcamp full time as a senior editor. I'm literally just walking to lunch, like playing To Pimp a Butterfly. And I'm like, man, there's a book in here. Like this would be really cool to like. What was it like when Robert Glasper walked into the room, when Anna Wise showed up, and Layla Hathaway was there, and yada yada. And so I thought about it, and then I reached out to a friend of mine who's a really awesome author, and he was like, "Yeah, that's a book. You need to totally write that." And so between myself and my agent, we broadened it out to say like, well, To Pimp a Butterfly is worth a book, but it's also, let's get into everything. Let's get into Section 80. Let's get into Damn. Let's get into all of the stuff. And so that was the focus. That was the start of it. I didn't really broaden it out until I got to Nairobi, Kenya, and I had space and time to just sort of think about the narrative and to think about like, how, like, for instance, Kendrick Lamar went to South Africa. And so as a Black American living in Africa, that kind of opened my head up as well to new thoughts and processes. And so honestly, I came to write the book as more of like it was almost like therapy as well, because when you're living in, I love Brooklyn, but Brooklyn is so fast paced that when you go somewhere else and you start writing about something like Kendrick, it just sort of opens your head up to all these different experiences. And so that's how I came to it. And that's how I went through the process of, it's a culture biography because Kendrick Lamar's music is going up this way at the same way America is going down this way. So it's like this Venn diagram right in the middle. And that's what the butterfly effect is. And that's how we landed on that project.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes so much sense to tell his story that way. And there's so much in there about the economics and the politics of not just his upbringing, but the context in which he released his records, which is also something that Sasha and Maureen touch on in their books as well. It's not just about the music. It's not just about the people who make it. It's about the world that they make it in. All of you engage with power in really fascinating ways in your books. And I wanted to talk to you guys about that too, about the idea of who gets to tell the story, the idea of who has told the story until now, and how has that shaped the ways in which we understand these artists. Particularly, something I've struck with in all three of your books is that all of you really engage with the ways in which genre has limited the packaging of an artist through genre has limited people's understanding of their music. So I'd love to talk to you guys in a little bit more depth about that and how you see that playing out in your writing. And I guess Maureen, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, with my project, one of the challenges I had was wrestling with this term rock and roll, because the meaning of that as a musical genre has changed over time. And what I started to realize was that as it was changing, the ability of African-American people, and including African-American women, to occupy that space was changing. So when the music started in the mid-1950s, it was called rhythm and blues first. It got labeled rock and roll, excuse me, so that it could have a more broad appeal. Rhythm and blues was very firmly identified with African-American audiences. It was perceived as music by and for Black Americans. But they were starting to see that white teenagers were interested in this music. It was kind of illicit. It was something very different. They were listening to it on the radio late at night when their parents didn't know. And so they wanted to really target that audience. So they changed the name of the music. They changed the genre name to rock and roll, it was still the same music. And so at that moment, it's only African Americans who were making this music, including people like Big Mama Thornton, who, to Sasha's point, was a phenomenal transgressor of gender expectations. And she's someone I write about in the book. But then over time, white Americans start to get involved in the music, and the perception of the music starts to change. What rock and roll is starts to change. So one of the things I deal with in the book is the shifting meanings of the genre, and also the shifting terminology. By the end of the 60s, it's not rock and roll anymore, it's rock. And rock and roll is this sort of old, kind of outdated, nostalgic thing that you have these sort of, you have tours featuring people like Chuck Berry and Little Richard, but it's no longer seen as the sort of music that's of the moment. That music is rock, and that is an almost exclusively, or it's understood to be an exclusively white space. So dealing with those kinds of questions about the shifting of genre terminology and meaning, and the way those shifts tended to make it very difficult for African Americans to access those genres, is something that was very important to the work that I was doing in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a history that I am also super fascinated by, and something that I'm engaging with in a project that I'm working on as well. And so I'm going to be citing your book, just FYI. Marcus.
Yeah, I tackle with it. I wrestle with it rather, because like when people think of Kendrick Lamar, obviously they think rap. They think he's a rapper. But just going back to Pepper Butterfly for a second, like he was a total jazz musician on that. Like, and that's what I didn't realize until I started digging back into his music for research purposes. It's like, even though, his music isn't technically jazz, when you think of the way he uses his voice as his instrument, he's totally a jazz musician. So like, whereas people like Terrace and Kamazi and all these people are using instruments to scale up and down to convey emotion, he's doing the exact same thing just with his voice. And he knows how to back away from the track and let it breathe for a little bit. He knows how to come back in with a different verse or a different voice or what have you. And so just, that's when I realized that something like To Pimp a Butterfly and Good Kid, Mad City and these records, they're definitely in the rap section, but they're everything. I mean, to me at least, I think To Pimp a Butterfly hits with the same resonance as a soul record. I feel like it should be up there with like What's Going On and Songs in the Key of Life and stuff like that, because it's total soul music, even though it isn't, he isn't playing keys or anything like that. It still hits all the same notes. And so that's where, I wrestled with genre in the book. Everything else, more or less, is hip hop. But at the same time, I love how he challenges what hip hop is supposed to be. It's not just somebody with a beat and they're rapping a million bars and suffocating the beat. He's, backing up and giving it air. And so, you can call him a rapper, but you can also call him a poet. You can call him a teacher. You can call him all these other things. You can't really classify his music. And so I feel like, Kendrick Lamar is definitely like, I wanted to humanize him in the book in a way, because without groups like The Roots and Mos Def and Common and people like that from the past, Tribe Called Quest, who were doing the exact same things, you don't have a Kendrick Lamar. And so what I wanted to sort of talk about in the book is the lineage. Like, okay, he's just paying homage to Outkast, and he's paying homage to Goody Mob and all these people, which also, yes, it's hip hop, but it's also like gospel and it's soul and it's everything else. And so that was the main thing I wrestled with. And, I feel like I don't know where he's going to go next, but it's definitely going to be some mix of like hip hop, poetry, and things like that.
Yeah, totally. I like a thing that I wasn't really thinking about until I read your book was how incredibly involved in the production he is on everything. And like I knew that, I knew that he was there for it. I knew that he guided it. But like the absolute infinitesimal details that he worked on. Like it, I've always had immense respect for him, and like I was just like, yeah, of course he was, of course he was. And I hope that that your book like helps people like see and understand that about him as well. Sasha, same question for you.
So I feel like historically genre is kind of a pretty recursive phenomenon in pop music, and like building on Maureen's point about how rock and roll in its earliest stages was this taboo, forbidden thing for, you know, its early white audiences. I feel like a lot of genre and a lot of the genres I write about deal with the tension between the accepted and the forbidden, both in terms of music and in terms of presentation. I think glam rock is a pretty good example of this, because glam rock emerges at the beginning of the 1970s, kind of in opposition to the way that progressive rock had been unfolding in England specifically. So there were a lot of straight white men playing very kind of melodically complex guitar music, more or less, with pastoral themes. And both David Bowie and T-Rex kind of came out of that scene and formed music in opposition to it by basically returning to 1950s Black American rock and roll. So going back to pretty simple guitar chords, pretty, you know, pretty derivative lyrics of that era. But they did so in a way that basically drew from the aesthetics of the post-Stonewall gay rights movement. So all of a sudden, people are doing rock and roll, like back to basics rock and roll, but really dressing it up. And, you know, the New York Dolls started doing this too in New York, and it was kind of happening on both sides of the Atlantic. And it was relatively trendy at the time to be either publicly gay or publicly bisexual if you were, you know, a white cis man making rock and roll music within glam rock. And so there's this mix of danger and stability within this genre specifically, because there were also trans women who were making glam rock. There were Black women making glam rock, and they weren't really codified within the canon of what's now considered glam rock, because they didn't have enough stable identity markers to really rest on. Even Bowie, you know, he came out as gay and melody maker in 1972, but he was married to Angie Bowie and he had a son. And so there's like this nuclear straight family that he can kind of hold up as, you know, proof that he's safe enough to play on the radio or to play on TV, even though he's wearing makeup and dressing in a way that he's basically stealing from trans women in New York City, pretty much directly. So there's definitely a lot of tension throughout the genres that I touched on between, you know, who's able to do what risks can be taken by whom, and who can take risks and still find themselves in the mainstream, in the spotlight. So you see a lot of that even up until today, but I think glam rock is a pretty tight encapsulation of that dynamic that just kind of unfolds over and over again throughout pop history.
Yeah, totally. That's a great example. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Actually, as I'm listening to all of you talk, another thing sort of bubbled up from thinking about both reading your books and listening to you guys talk today, just the role of the voice. And all of you talk about the role of vocals in a way that is really like present and important, in a way in which a lot of music critics specifically like don't get into and don't engage with. And so I think that's fascinating in books that are both so personal and so culturally contextualized. So I wanted to talk to you guys about the role of the voice in all of your books. Marcus, we'll start with you on that one. Like you mentioned it a little bit while you were talking too.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's vitally important, and I feel like it's something that I struggle with. I've always struggled with as a music critic, as a music journalist, is having a voice but not writing a piece like I'm the voice on a thing. So, you know, I feel like it had, the role of the voice in my book definitely had dual meanings where, like I was saying before, Kendrick's voice is vitally important because if you've ever listened to a Kendrick Lamar record, like he comes in with so many different voices. Like he'll come in with his voice, he's pitched down to something else, pitched up to something else. And he does a really good job, and I've learned this through writing the book. He does a good job of deferring. Like if he hears a voice within his circle, he does a really good job of stepping back and empowering that person to be just as open and just as creative as he is. So whether it's somebody like Joseph Leimberg, who's sort of the narrator of To Pimp a Butterfly, or whether it's somebody like Anna Wise, who helped Kendrick discover his voice and to help him discover his creativity, his unbridled creativity. So I feel like for him especially, voice is truly important because, you know, sometimes when you listen to his music, you can tell that, he has certain songs where it's like, okay, this is just about me being the best rapper. This other thing is going to talk about survivor's guilt. It's going to talk about depression and, paying taxes and stuff like that. And so that's where his voice sort of comes into play there. And through researching his music in that way, it also kind of helped me develop my own critical and artistic voice because, as other people on the call know, like when you're writing something from a sort of journalistic perspective, you're taught to just kind of take yourself out of it and not be a part of what's going on. But I had to learn really quickly in this book, like, no, you have a voice too, and I had to learn to just sort of step out and step into my own voice in terms of being the narrator of the story to this point. And so, yeah, that's a good question. I feel like voice is definitely vitally important. Probably, I think more so than music sometimes, because sometimes music can cover up the fact that you're not talking about anything. So, so when you actually have that voice shining through that, cutting through all of that, I feel like that lasts. That's the reason why we're talking about Kendrick still, even though he's still creating. That's the reason why his music still resonates, because that voice and that honesty shines through every time.
Yeah, that's 100% true for sure. Maureen, same question.
So I'm fortunate, I guess, because I'm not coming from the journalistic tradition. I'm coming from cultural anthropology. And so in cultural anthropology, it's sort of expected that you, the anthropologist, the person who is writing up this study of whatever it is going to at least some degree include yourself in that narration. So the I, the capital I, is all right to have in the text. So I decided to stick with that. But I think because the subject was personal, and it would have been possible for me to write it, with a little bit more distance and maybe just say I at the beginning in the introduction and then never mention myself again. But I really felt like, to go back to that word journey, I felt like I wanted to allow that part of the story to be in the book. And it's not in every chapter, but in some of the chapters I do refer to just, trying to find out the answers to some of these questions. I spend some time in the introduction just talking about myself as a music fan. What did I listen to when I was growing up? So that part of voice, very similar to what Marcus said, became a part of the book. And then the other part is because all of the women who I talk about in the book are vocalists, I needed to talk about voice. And one of the challenges in rock music history or rock criticism is that the voice really isn't what rock critics have wanted to talk about over the years. I mean, it comes into things, but the emphasis has been more on songwriters, you know, songwriting, and on the wonderful guitar. And I love guitars. I love the sound of the guitar in a rock song. But the vocalists kind of fall into the background. We talk about the lyrics, but there's not so much of a discussion of the vocalists. So when I started thinking about, well, what about the voice? What about these singing voices of these women? How did they impact other artists? I started to see that there were really strong connections and very strong influence from these African-American women on other singers, on other African-American singers, but also on the white rock singers who were basically studying these women's vocal approaches and trying to, in some ways, you know, imitating. And you know, the obvious example, I have the cover of my book up because they didn't have it on the website for buying the books. So this is Tina Turner. A lot of commentary about how Mick Jagger borrowed from Tina Turner's onstage style, some of her movements. She taught him to dance, apparently. But also he was modeling his vocal style on Tina Turner, on Irma Thomas, on other African-American women. And so the list goes on and on. But because rock critics are more interested in talking about other aspects of a rock song, the vocal component really falls away. So, you know, in the book, in addition to centering African-American women in rock, I also wanted to center the voice in rock and think about it in ways that you don't always see in histories of rock and roll.
Yeah, it's awesome. I love that you did that. It's such vital and important work. Sasha, same question for you.
Thank you for asking this, because I feel like this is all I think about. Even now that the book is done, it's like I just keep thinking and like wanting to write about the way that we find sung meaning in the way a voice sounds, because you're right, Maureen, historically rock critics do not talk enough about the particularities of voice that arise in songs and how there's just so much meaning loaded into the way a voice soars or breaks or fails. So I was thinking while writing the book a lot about voice as a gender marker, because it's one of many cues that human beings use to kind of determine what is going on with another human being, right? Just kind of on a very basic level. And that becomes more complex within a musical setting where voice can be a way of enacting a fantasy identity, or, you know, you can sing in a way that you would never speak, or sing through heightened emotions that you wouldn't necessarily express when you're not on stage or in a recording booth. So I thought a lot about voice and singing, the singing voice particularly, as like a fantasy space where forbidden genders could be enacted. I've also been thinking a lot about cyborg voices and the way that technology modulates the way voices sound, kind of beginning with the talk box and the vocoder, looping the human voice through machines that sound like machines and creating this voice that is neither a computer nor a human entirely. I focus a lot on Wendy Carlos and Rachel Elkind and their use of the vocoder in the early 1970s, first in Beethoven, and then the Ninth Symphony, creating like a futuristic cyborgian Ninth Symphony for the Clockwork Orange soundtrack, and how that launched a series of different artists from different countries throughout the 70s and 80s using the vocoder to create futuristic science fiction music, essentially. You know, Herbie Hancock did this, Kraftwerk, and later Afrika Bambaataa. And that has been, I think, really key to trans music in the past 5 years or so. Between 100 gecs or Arca, a ton of people have used autotune, which is kind of the descendant of vocoder, to corrupt their voice, pitch it up, make it sound recognizably human enough that it's still kind of somatically identifiable, like you hear it and you still feel that there's a human being on the other end of that, but also corrupted enough that it sounds like it's coming from a human in a distant future or in another plane of existence. So I think that specifically has been really useful for the articulation of trans identity specifically, because voice is such a loaded avenue of expression for trans people, because it is so heavily gendered and it is so contentious, you know, how you use it depending on how you want to be perceived. So yeah, I think about all this a lot, about how voice constitutes meaning, especially within the pop song.
Yeah, absolutely. It's super key. I have been thinking a whole lot about doing a project lately where I like work with other trans musicians and we all like do some sort of like combined vocal project, because like I've been noticing that regardless of gender, a lot of trans voices tend to end up in the same octave. And that's like really fascinating and beautiful and like interesting to me. I also like think a whole lot about trans women using like vocal aid software to sound the way that they want to sound, instead of relying on you know the voices that they have naturally. But it's a really fascinating, cool thing for sure. We've got about 9 minutes left, so I wanted to sort of open it up a little bit to our chat box, and if anybody has got any questions for the panel, we'd love to take them. And there's a lot of love in the chat box in case you're not looking at it.
Thanks, chat box.
There's no questions at the moment. So I guess.
Oh, I'm actually seeing questions.
Are you?
Yeah. So I see a question for all of us.
There are questions.
Do you see them?
I see them in the Q&A. There they are. Yeah. So Michael Loeb says, thank all of you for this discussion. Marcus, do you discuss Untitled Unmastered in the book? Where do you place that album in this discussion of genre?
Untitled Unmastered. Oh man, that's a good question. I think it's I would say it's more jazz, but you know, consider the source, because to me everything is jazz. So, but it definitely has some jazzy elements, because you can tell that it was recorded during the September Butterfly sessions, and that was like you could tell they were totally on some, you know, Outkast meets LA jazz kind of stuff. So that's where I would place it. I would place it more on the jazz funk end than the hip hop end.
I think that's fair to say. A question for all of you. Who are your music icons and inspirations? Marcus, anyone else besides Kendrick? Thanks all for this vibrant and fascinating discussion. And that comes from Emily Marie Colucci. And whoever wants to start can start.
Well, I'll answer. It's hard because there's so many. I would say that David Bowie got me through high school and college. So he was very important, still very important, and fascinating for having such a diverse body of music, but also for the reasons that Sasha was talking about, you know, also, you know, I don't know if problematic is the right word, but there are challenges, you know, with dealing with him that are really productive challenges. So I would say David Bowie and Prince. And then from the time I was very young, my favorite musician was Nina Simone, and my father had to play. There was a particular Nina Simone record that he had to play for me every night. That went on for a while. So those I would say are my key icons.
Marcus or Sasha?
I'll jump in. Musical inspirations. I love, love, love Alice Coltrane, Minnie Riperton. You know, I grew up listening to like Public Enemy and Boogie Down Productions and stuff like that. So those are the ones that come to mind. And definitely the Roots. Like I went to all the Root shows. Anytime they came to the 930 Club, I was there. You know, so I would say those are the main ones for me that sort of, you know, develop the aesthetic.
For me, I think Karen Dreiser of The Knife and Fever Ray has historically been a huge guiding light. There's someone whose use of pitch shifting and vocal modulation just really hit me in the gut before I really knew why, before I was out as transmasculine, before they were out as transmasculine. So that's been kind of a cool historical current, I guess, that getting to listen to them over, you know, the past 15 years or so. I'm relatively new to his music, but this year Beverly Glenn Copeland has also been a really great guiding light. He made a wonderful synth album in the mid 80s that kind of went unheard for several decades until about 2015 when it was rediscovered and redistributed. And there's a wonderful documentary about his work in life called Keyboard Fantasies that made me weep profusely pretty recently. So he's wonderful.
Yeah, Beverly Glenn Copeland's amazing. I'm got hip to him in the last like 5 years or so. He's really incredible, and there's a great new compilation of his work out. We've got 3 minutes, so time for just one more quick question. And Sarah asks, what was the hardest thing for each author to remove or exclude from the book? And Maureen, we can start with you again.
I went back and forth with my editor because it seemed like I had everything in the book, and we were trying to figure out how to make it shorter. So I feel like, I guess with each of the women, there were so many stories, and I can't actually off the top of my head, I can't think of a specific one, but I think it was the feeling like, because I was not aware of a book like this existing. So there's that feeling of needing to tell, you know, finding out all this information and then wanting to share it, being afraid that if I didn't, then no one, it would go unknown for another, you know, huge chunk of time. So I can't think of a specific example, but it's more that feeling of wanting to take this opportunity to tell as much as I could because I hadn't heard those stories before.
Totally. Marcus, do you want to touch on that super quick too?
Yeah, real quick. I knew pretty early on, even though they knew about the book, that I wasn't going to be able to talk to Kendrick directly. So I couldn't get into all the personal aspects, but thankfully I was able to talk to people around him. So couldn't get super personal like I wanted to.
And Sasha, for you?
For me, I feel like it was more like I had to submit a finished draft of the book while a lot of exciting new music was coming out that would fit perfectly. So it was less like cutting things and more just like I ran out of time, or I had to finish writing it, and what I'm writing about is still ongoing.
Totally. We are out of time, you guys. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been an incredible discussion. I knew it was going to be. All of you are so great. Everyone go pick up their books. You can get a link right through the Book Festival website to purchase all of their books and support independent bookstores. Thank you so, so much for doing this panel, and have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Oh, it's been lovely.